to begin our book discussion on capturing institutional change, the book that has been written by my friend and colleague, Dr. Himanshu Jha. The book, Capturing Institutional Change, the case of Right to Information Act in India, examines what, why, and how institutional change through the lens of transformation in information regime in India by tracing the passage of the Right to Information Act, 2005. Just before the beginning of our book discussion, there is an organizational announcement. Professor Rahul Mukherjee today cannot attend this book discussion. A personal emergency. Now, at the moment, he's in India, and he apologized to attend this meeting. Therefore, I will be the chair of the meeting. I'm Zarhani, colleague of Dr. Jha, assistant professor at Department of Political Science, South Asia Institute. The book that Dr. Jha published, OUP New Delhi, actually is a book that actually can be seen as a historical, institutional, and comparative. It takes an accurate look at the processes within the Indian state. And we know that it is well known that India has launched the right-based approach to development. Indian citizens, for example, enjoy the right to work, forest resources, and education. Also, the right to information, which gives citizens access basic information. And Dr. Jha actually, in his research, talks about institutional change. The research argues that in the processes within the state after the series of examination of behavior within Indian judiciary, parliament, and bureaucracy. Actually, we have today two important guests and discussants. Dr. Gabriele Kurg-Wisner, who is assistant professor of politics and global studies at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Akshay Mangla, who is associate professor in international relations at the State Business School, University of Oxford. We structured the group discussion as follows. We have 20 minutes discussion by oral discussion, and after that we have a Q&A by Dr. Jha and also the discussants. So, Dr. Mang, are you here? Yes. So, hello. Good to see you. So let's begin with the first 20 minutes with Dr. Mangla.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, and I believe, there you go. Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak on Himanshu's outstanding book. I've been following Himanshu's work over the years, and it's just really exciting and I think quite rewarding to see the book out and to read it. And so I'll take maybe the next 15 minutes or so to share some thoughts on the book, its contributions, and some questions that it raises. And then I'll hand it over to Gabby. So just to get started, I think the book can be applauded for asking a big question, and the big question that I see it asking is this, which is how and why do we see a shift from a secrecy-oriented state to one that is comparatively open and transparent? And I just want to pause and just consider the relevance of this question. So when we think about state functioning, we often think about efficiency, we think about accountability, but this notion of openness, is much broader than both efficiency and accountability, because it gets to the orientation of the state vis-a-vis its citizens with respect to the provision of information. And so the idea of a state shifting from secrecy to to one that is more open and transparent is an important one, just in terms of how citizens relate to the state and potentially their welfare as well. Because if information is provided to citizens, they can then make demands on the state with a better information base. Not to mention that the state itself could potentially make better decisions with a more open information base. So I think the importance of this question needs to be flagged, and also at this current period, this current juncture that we're in, where we don't seem to see states moving in a direction necessarily of greater openness and transparency, though there's, I'm sure, variation. A trend that one observes, at least in India and in other major countries, even other democracies, one is seeing a move towards less transparency. Now, the answer that Himanshu's book puts forward is state-centered and institutional. So the focus of this manuscript is on the Right to Information Act in India, which is an important piece of legislation. The argument is that this act was the culmination of an incremental and slow-moving process whereby ideas emerged endogenously within the state. So there's a gradual shift from a norm of secrecy, which then faces a counterweight by ideas favoring openness. And the book really takes us through the saga of this process and how it is that openness eventually won out over secrecy. And the winning out is measured by the legislation that was actually passed, and it's not insignificant. It's major changes in how the Indian state provides information and how much it provides. Now, a further step in the argument is that these ideas of openness emerged from within the state itself. These weren't simply imposed on the state either from the global political system, nor was it simply a response to ideas lingering in society. So it was not just social movements, but within the state, and the political activities of state actors played a crucial role. And this argument challenges existing explanations, those that might focus only on elite networks or those that may focus on bottom-up social movements. So for all these reasons, I think the manuscript really ought to be applauded. And here's some things that I particularly liked about the manuscript. For one, it puts policymaking in historical perspective. So in contrast to a lot of research that's done in political science, policies are often treated as the result or the immediate result of some proximate political shift. And rarely do we get a piece of work that takes a longue durée view of policymaking. And it's actually quite a difficult task to follow slow-moving historical threads. But I think the book does this really well, and it does it using painstaking research, data that are drawn from multiple sources, archival sources, official documents, letters from various political actors, interviews of state and non-state actors. So I think the historicization of policymaking is something that the book really brings out well. The second thing that I think the book does, which I believe is an advance on other research on ideas, is that it brings out the political process whereby ideas are initiated and how they get moved around and then all of a sudden seem to become common sense and acceptable within the state. And I think it's important just to flag that this work, this whole genre of research on ideas, at least in the social sciences, was inspired by Thomas Kuhn and Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, where Kuhn challenges the notion of a rational move from one paradigm in the physical sciences. So the classic case being the shift from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, right? And so he brings out the political disagreements between rival scientific camps. But often in the social sciences, when this approach was imported, ideas were sort of treated as kind of an independent variable and very difficult to get a hold of what they were. And then all of a sudden you see a shift. But what this book does, I think, more than others that I've read in this genre, is that it actually brings out the agents who are carrying the ideas. So through the field research and through the data collection involved, Jha's book highlights the agents, including the bureaucrats, the elected officials, activists, academics who were involved in pressing for transparency. And then it also brings out the political pressures they were up against. So this is not an abstract discussion of ideas, but a very real, pragmatic political one. And so I think that is something to be applauded. And then finally, I will say on, in terms of, my plaudits, and of course, there's more things I could say, but given time constraints, these are the top three that I picked on. The book engages deeply with institutionalist theory. And it engages with theories of persistence and change. And I think both are relevant. And I think the book makes an argument for why we actually need to address both in trying to understand any change that takes place in a political system. So the manuscript addresses a core theoretical problem for institutional theory, which is to explain change in the absence of an exogenous shock. So when there isn't an exogenous shock to a system, it becomes more difficult for institutionalists to arrive at some argument or some clear mechanisms for change. And we can see in everyday politics that change, of course, happens, and it often happens in other ways. But demonstrating it empirically is very difficult. And it's even more difficult when that change happens endogenously through gradual processes over time. And I think the book does this quite well. And it does this because it embarks from the origins of state secrecy. Had the book only looked at the more recent period, we would not have understood where the threat of secrecy came from in the first place and understand what it was that activists in the initial periods were fighting up against and why it was that secrecy actually initially won out. And so I think by demonstrating how a competing idea to transparency, namely secrecy, initially won, we're able to then make better sense of why later on you see openness winning. So I think the mechanisms of persistence that are brought out in the first part then allows us to understand the mechanisms of change later on. And so just getting to the mechanisms that the book puts forward, I had a few questions, and I think these can be questions for discussion or questions for future research, really. So the first mechanism that the book highlights is the role of opposition parties and the forging of ties between progressive state and societal actors. So the first big push for transparency really comes around the period of emergency. And that is a time where political, civic rights were being curtailed heavily by the Indira Gandhi regime. And there was the major role of the JP movement and Janata Party, the short-lived Janata Party government that really put in the wedge to really initiate this process, right? And the growing cooperation between opposition parties and the press. And so this part of the book really talks about the source of the ideational shift, but also how ideas initially became embedded within the state. And so the embedding happened through bureaucratic institutions like Indian Institute of Public Administration, but also into some laws that were initially enacted or changes to laws. But then very neatly, the book points to a counter movement, right? So this is Rajiv Gandhi's attempt to amend the Commission of Inquiry Act in 1986, right? And then this feeds into a second big decisive push that came in the National Front government, which was stoked by the centralization of authority under Rajiv Gandhi, the corruption under Bofors arms deal, and so on. So opposition parties are playing a major role. And this just leads me to wonder more broadly, what is the role of political competition more broadly in thinking about ideas as a source of change? Right? If you think about the ideas being a source of institutional change, one possibility is that opposition parties take an idea and put it on their party platforms and then compete based on that idea, right? And so I would like to think through that a bit more. How can we consider the role of political competition as being a mechanism or maybe a background condition that allows a nascent idea to gain traction? So that was the first set of questions I had, was just around that process. Now, moving to the second mechanism, the book talks about the creation of epistemic networks. And so this is highlighted through various conferences between state and societal actors, government officials, academics. So conferences with CMs, the Shori Committee, which really institutionalized these networks within the state. This mechanism, while really interesting, and I think this is an important part of the story that goes beyond the state in some sense. It's state-centric, but it's actually state and society. And I think the book rightly points to the fact that a state is rather porous. And so we shouldn't think of these as being, oppositional categories, but perhaps having linkages across them. But it led me to wonder, when we think about epistemic networks, certainly epistemic networks can have different political and normative commitments. And I wonder, what if these networks were committed to closure, or network participants were not open to debate and criticism? Would they have had the impact that they had in sustaining this sort of change? And this leads me to consider, or maybe hypothesize, a third mechanism, which is policy deliberation. There's room for there to be debate about policy, an exchange of ideas, a forging of linkages, and that forging of linkages isn't all in agreement. Of course, a lot of the activists that get highlighted in the book may push for more transparency than what the state actors want. Some of the bureaucrats may want just enough transparency for themselves and not necessarily as much for the activists and so on. But if policy deliberation is necessary, I wonder if there's some requirement that there be a degree of trust between state and society, or between citizens and public institutions. And if that level of trust gets depleted, can one have a robust deliberation that allows for ideas to get sustained? And I think about this in the present period. And of course, the book ends, the core argument ends before the current regime, although in the conclusion, there's a discussion about the amendments, the 2019 amendments. But I wonder, in a period where this is a world of post-truth politics, what is the role of information in post-truth politics? And if citizens don't trust public institutions, and this distrust can be exploited by state actors, right? What are the limits of this policy change? And could we be seeing maybe a reversion back as a consequence? So I think I'll just stop there, but say, oh, sorry, I had one more. I'm just going through my list. There was one more thought I had before I hand it over to Gabby. This was the issue of power, and how agents in power and which institutions holding power may play a key role in which ideas of transparency or secrecy gain favor. So throughout the book, there's a discussion of center-state relations within India. And at various points, there's discussions of ideas emerging from central government, and at other points, ideas emerging from subnational governments and subnational activists and movements. And I wonder what role federalism is playing in the transmission of ideas, either from state to center or from center to the state. And in the periods that one looks where the shifts happened in the book, so the emergency period, we see a concentration of authority in New Delhi. And then later on under Rajiv Gandhi, an attempt to do that once more. And then you see a counter movement. And so in the post-emergency period, one sees states demanding greater autonomy and say over policy and implementation. And again, that happens after, after Rajiv Gandhi. I wonder if one would expect a similar change to take place now, or maybe not. Maybe the center has so much power because the center is also controlling state governments through various means, using the tools of the state. And by the way, technologies of governance have also changed, which the book doesn't talk about as much, but I wonder, given that we're talking about information and the role of information, I wonder what the technology of information controlled by the central government could be potentially a factor that limits whether this openness carries forward in the current regime. So I think I'll just stop there, and thank you for this opportunity to engage with this book, and I'll hand it over to Gabby.
Thanks, Akshay. Thanks for the comments and your views and insights. So just let's continue our conversation with Gabriele, and floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was equally a pleasure to read this book. It's if anyone here hasn't read it yet, it's beautifully written. It's clearly argued. It's, as actually said, painstakingly researched, and it's I think a book that will be of enormous interest, not just to scholars of institutional change, but also to those with interest in understanding state-society relations, the ideas, the role of ideas and of norms, the politics of information, the politics of transparency in India, but also far beyond. So I think, you know, there's theory presented in this book that I think has the potential to carry to a lot of different contexts. So I found it a very powerful and persuasive work, and it was a delight to read it. Just for a little bit of context, my own work is centered on much more bottom-up processes. I studied these quotidian citizenship practices and sort of conditions under which citizens do or do not make claims on the state, and under which frontline local bureaucrats are or are not held to account. And so what was really kind of a delight for me to read is a very different perspective in Dr. Jha, if I may, Himanshu's book, which is a much more state-centered and in many ways more top-down story that involves quite elite actors in the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, the bureaucracy, but there is still a role for societal actors, academics, journalists, bureaucrats, come activists, and it's a fascinating story that unfolds to see how all these different actors are sort of dancing together in these different ways. So my comments will focus largely on those state-society linkages. It's sort of the area that I've thought most deeply about in my own work. But I think I'll start maybe just by saying a little bit about what I see as the core puzzles, arguments, and contributions of the book, and then talk a little bit about some areas where I think the research could be extended in some pretty exciting ways. So the core puzzle, as Akshay said, is really profound, right? If we paraphrase the question, it's why did the state open itself up? Why did the state open itself to scrutiny and critique and demands and claims? And Himanshu puts it very succinctly, I'm quoting from page 3 of the introduction. Why would the state, so deeply penetrated by vested interests, initiate a change in the legal framework of the information regime, which would be used variously to highlight and expose the very nexus set to govern its institutions? And this is a question I think that is of core interest to anybody studying governance and accountability. The argument, and Akshay summarized this already very nicely, right, is that this change was 1, gradual, and 2, ideational, due to this churning of ideas and a layering of ideas over time, over 2 periods of time in particular that are historically traced in the book. A first period of time where those ideas are nascent and emerging and on the margins, and a second period of time where they start to enter the mainstream and they become prevalent in what Himanshu calls state thinking. And a really interesting discussion of the tipping point about where those ideas really come to the fore and take hold and become so central. And the idea that this new idea of openness replaces or displaces an idea of secrecy. And that's something I'll come back to in a few minutes because it's something I'd like to discuss a little bit more. The second part of the argument, also as actually pointed out, of course, is that this is endogenous institutional change, which means that these ideas about openness have their genesis within the state itself and are not simply a reflexive response to demands generated in society. So it's not a bottom-up driven story, it's a story of the genesis of these ideas emerging from state actors themselves. Third, there is still a role for societal actors, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, but this is a complementary role. We have, again, the idea of this epistemic networks, the idea that there is pressure from both without and within, simultaneously working in concert, putting pressure both from within the state and from without the state. And then the last piece is that none of this happens in a domestic vacuum. This happens with the influence of global norms about transparency, about an emerging right to information. There is a global discourse developing along the same timeframes. And what I love about this part of the argument is that it puts India in the middle of those conversations, but not as a passive consumer of those conversations. So those global norms are being articulated, engaged with, and then reinterpreted and adapted and changed and sort of made to fit, or in a sense vernacularized into the Indian context, which I thought was a really nice contribution to sort of broader literature on international norm diffusion. So I think, like Akshay, I'm going to focus on three things, kind of what I saw as three major, I don't know why we always pick three, right? But three kind of major contributions that I saw in this book. There are, of course, many more, but I'll highlight these three. The first is returning to the venerable, but in many ways neglected tradition of bringing the state back in. Recentering again the state in our analysis, because it seems to be something that as political scientists we do and then forget and then do and then forget. So it's good to do it again. Secondly, bringing ideas back in, again, something that comes in and out of fashion, and it's about time that it's brought back in again. And third, returning, and I think a really powerful and also new way to frameworks of state-society synergy. So these were three things that I found really a joy to read, because they return in some ways to much older literatures, but with new insights and new context, and I think really push our thinking forward on those three fronts. I'll say a few words about bringing the state back in. Akshay said more on this, so I'll be brief on this count. I was brought back to foundational readings from political science graduate school, kind of what is the state? Who is the state? What's it representing? Why is it doing what it's doing, right? And you can think about, or at least what's drilled into our heads, these completely different views or conceptions of the state. There's the liberal view where the state is, particularly in a representative democracy, an aggregation and representation of societal interests. And in this book, Himanshu clearly shows that that's not the story that's evolving here. Right? This is not simply an expression of societal demands. There's the Marxist view, right, that the state is an expression of particular class interests. And again, we see that that's not the full account in this story. And then there's the statist view, that the state is its own autonomous, insulated actor with its own ideas, its own interests, its own culture, its own way of being, its own incentives. And to an extent, there's elements of that view in this book, but drawing on work from scholars like Joel McDowell and Peter Evans, thinking about embedded autonomy, thinking about a state in society framework, Himanshu very deftly softens that statist view to sort of make us think hard about the fact that states can have partial autonomy and still have these strong linkages to society. And in fact, it's in that complicated, incomplete autonomy and those linkages that we find this story of change. So I thought that was really exciting to see details. One other thing, just a quick note that I loved, there's a danger in the sort of state-centered view that the state becomes a black box and sort of becomes, it's sort of paradoxical. By centering the state, it sometimes becomes a black box. It's treated sort of, the state becomes personified. The state did or the state thought. And we never know really who that is. And so what I really enjoyed was the disaggregated, unpacked view of the state, sort of really splitting things apart and saying, let's look at the executive, let's look at the legislature, let's look at the judiciary, let's look at the bureaucracy. I thought there were some places where this could have gone a little deeper. There were references throughout to elements within the state, kind of technocratic elements or progressive elements, and every single time I said, who are they? And sometimes those individuals are actually named, and we hear a little bit about their life stories and kind of how they came to be where they are and how they came to think how they think. And that was fascinating, and I thought was a real contribution. So this idea of having a state-centered account, but really unpacking who and what that is, I think was beautifully done. Let me talk a little bit more about the bringing ideas back into the analysis. And I think what's so refreshing is that in making a ideational, excuse me, I'm going to turn this off so I don't get dinging noises in my background. In making an ideational argument, Himanshu is moving us away from a purely interest-based analysis, sort of strong interest-based tradition that again is something that kind of becomes drummed into our heads in political science. And so it's sort of pushing us out of the liberal conception of politics where we think about politics really as just this contest of interests, and you've got winners and losers in these political competitions. And in foregrounding the role of ideas, you're very effectively pushing us out of that framework. I really love the idea of layering of ideas, and I wanted to discuss it a little bit more. The argument in the book is that there are layers of ideas. As I said, he maps two historical periods, a first layer and a second layer. In the first layer, the ideas are emergent, and in the second layer, they become consolidated and sort of brought to the fore and become more mainstream. The imagery of layering, though, suggests that the old ideas don't go away. They're built upon and they're still there. And so I wanted to think more and maybe discuss more about what happens to the ideas of secrecy when ideas of openness are layered upon them. The imagery of layering suggests that there's the potential for bleeding, right? That the old ideas of secrecy can and will, and as we see in Indian politics, do bleed through very often norms of openness. And so I guess one place where I felt I wanted to maybe push a little bit was in some of the language that's employed about the replacement of norms or the displacement of norms. I wonder if this is something that can ever be complete. There's a before story and an after story. And in places in the book, as powerful as that framework is, I found that a little black and white, because what I love about the image of layering is that it's not black and white. It's going to be messy and mixed. And we'll see these moments of bleeding where the old norms and the old ideas sort of poke through. And so I wondered if the before and after framework might be a little binary. And there could be some really interesting discussion and work to think about how to sort of move it beyond a before and after story and sort of think, as actually said, about persistence as well as about change. I also wanted to think a little bit about the question of a quote norm of openness, and ask whether what we see in the RTI Act is indeed a norm of openness, or is it a law of openness? I'm not by any means questioning the profound and kind of momentous impact of this law. And as clearly detailed in the book, there are strong norms of openness, the ideational argument that sort of provokes and creates the space in which this new policy could be enacted. But I wonder if we extend our time frame and we think about, and this is not something that is the purview of the book, it's maybe the second book or another research project, right? If we think about extending the time horizon and not just thinking about the passage of the act and the law, but we think about its implementation and its kind of lived enactment in Indian politics, then I wonder how strong the norm of openness is. And I wonder what it would take to thicken the norm beyond a de jure norm, a norm written in law, into a de facto practice norm that's actually implemented. And I know Himanshu is also working on this, right? How is RTI actually being implemented? Why do we see subnational variation? Why do we see local variation? Who's taking up this law? Who's resisting it? Why do we see pushback? But this is a really interesting question. We do see a new norm of openness, at least in the legal sphere. What does it take to thicken that norm into sort of the actual practice of politics in implementation? I'll say maybe a last set of comments on the state-society framework and state-society complementarity, because I found this really, really interesting. I love the notion of the epistemic network, and again, the centering of ideas that enables us to think not just about common shared interests across the public-private divide, but common shared ideas that are uniting actors, sometimes with conflict, right? But uniting them again across the public-private divide. I liked this part of the book so much that I had a quibble with it, in that I wanted more. So this is a good sign, right? When a book sort of provokes questions and you want more, it's a really good sign of the richness of the work. This is chapter 4 of the book that sort of unpacks the state-society story. And I wondered about the time frame in this chapter. The story starts in the late 1980s. The Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, the MKSS, very influential in this time period, was founded, I believe, in 1987. And this chapter sort of picks up in the late 1980s into the 1990s and the 2000s, and talks about this epistemic community, talks about the relationships between societal actors in academia, in journalism, in activist networks. And I found myself wondering, well, where did they all come from? There are longer genealogies and longer histories at play here. This is, of course, too much for one book, right? So again, maybe this is a different research agenda, but it's a complementary research agenda, because I felt that just as you extended your time horizon back historically, all the way back to independence, to trace the evolution of ideas within the state, I would love to see the same tracing back and evolution of ideas among societal actors. They didn't emerge tabula rasa in the 1990s. There are long histories here, and it would be really amazing. And I think the theoretical framework that you've developed of the layered tipping point and the churning of ideas could be employed with great effect to similarly trace the evolution of ideas within social networks and among societal actors. So I think there's a great opportunity, in fact, to extend your theoretical framework and to deepen and complement the societal part of the story. A last note that I found really interesting was thinking about the state-society linkages. And it made me think about how much we talk in political science about the role of brokers. And we're conditioned to think of brokers as these quid pro quo agents. We think of them as partisan brokers, as political brokers. We think of them in electoral politics and in electoral engagements, electoral exchanges. And what we really see in these state-society linkages in the story that's being told in this book is an entirely different kind of broker, an idea broker. And what's happening here is essentially you have actors, for example, Aruna Roy of the MKSS, an activist but former IAS officer who's serving as interlocutor. She's able to move back and forth between two spaces. She's an activist, but she understands how the state works. And this made me think about, and this is actually something that in a completely different setting I'm working on in some of my own work, think about expanding our notion of brokerage to include these really different kinds of exchange, intermediation of ideas, framing of ideas, moving back and forth between different spheres, making those boundaries between spheres more porous. I found it fascinating too that some of these interlocutors or brokers, these points of linkages, were bureaucrats themselves, quote unquote sympathetic bureaucrats. So here we have bureaucrats as brokers, right? We usually think of brokers as non-state actors, but here in fact we have actors within the state who are playing this brokerage role. So this is something I think that's actually maybe an unsung contribution of the book, is to think about the role of intermediation, interlocution, and brokerage in ways that are quite new in political science, where we tend to think more about this kind of quid pro quo exchange. So I'll stop here, but I'll say maybe in closing, 3 areas where I would love to see more work in further research, whether that falls on your shoulders, Himanshu, or on others who get excited by your research agenda. But first is, as I mentioned already, to see more on implementation of RTI, not just the act itself, but the implementation of the act, both by state actors, but also by societal actors who choose to take up the act. You start in your introduction with a story of a man you met in Bihar, Mazloom, who uses RTI, who files an RTI petition because he's been denied a housing loan under the Indira Awas Yojana. And this made me think about some of my own field work in Rajasthan, which by many accounts is, the birthplace of RTI and all this kind of stuff, the birthplace of MKSS. I spent 2 years carrying out field work in Rajasthan, surveying and interviewing people in over 100 villages, and met a grand total of 2 people who had heard of RTI. This was in 2010, so 5 years after the act. I met a total of 2 people who had heard of RTI and a total of 1 who had actually filed an RTI petition. This is not to undersell the contributions of RTI. It's being used to enormous effect by movements, by public interest litigants, by journalists. But I'd like to hear more about its penetration to a more local level, its implementation at a more systemic level. And I'd like to hear that as part of the process of institutional change, kind of extending the time horizon of institutional change, going back to this idea of thickening the norm of openness. The last thing maybe is to situate RTI. It's this amazing case developed in the book. What does it sit alongside? It sits alongside other things, the right to food, the right to work. And so tracing out and telling the story a little bit, we hear a little bit of this in the story of MKSS, but to trace out more fully the relationship between these different rights, and why is it that RTI, the right to information, got legs and ran in a certain way, but other rights, even though they have also become codified and justiciable in certain ways, haven't sort of gained the same grounding in certain ways. At least you can argue that about the right to food. So I thought that would be interesting to think about a little bit. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully I haven't talked for too long, and I look forward to the conversation, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to read this book. It really is a wonderful tour de force.
Thank you, Gabriela, for your comments, insights, and reflections. Actually, I invite Himanshu to begin conversation and reflect on the book discussion and insights by Akshay and Gabriela. Himanshu.
Thanks, Hussein, and thanks, Akshay and Gabby, for summarizing this book and saying good things about the book. Sometimes the book discussions are like office appraisals. You start by saying good things and then end up suggesting that you are fired. But thankfully, that has not happened. And you have said good things, and you have actually shown me some direction towards the research. I would start by actually paying homage to P.B. Sawant, who is one of the main actors in my RTI story, who passed away last night. He was the judge in the S.P. Gupta case, and he was also one of the architects of Right to Information Bill. And I would also start by saying that I miss Rahul, who is my kind of ideational collaborator in this project since beginning. And some of the work that he has done on economic reforms in India is actually the footprints of that research one can feel, and one can actually almost sniff Rahul in this book. So I'm missing Rahul. So Akshay, you started by saying that what now, you know, and Gabby also started talking about the thickening of norms and what happens, especially in the current scenario. And my feeling is the same kind of ideational churning that I've kind of traced in the book, the same kind of churning is actually taking place now. The state from the beginning has been Janus-faced about the norm of secrecy and the norm of openness. So sometimes they open up, sometimes they close. And that's like, that's the future research. And that's my future research agenda, that what are the, you know, when and why, you know, the states close and when do they open up? But that is not to kind of undermine the power of RTI in the sense that, you know, even if from the beginning, the states realize that they have actually let loose a thing which is actually getting back at them and biting them. And then they kind of started this whole series of proposed amendments. So starting with whether file notings should be disclosed with the right to information applications, or whether the PM, whether the cabinet notes of the cabinet meeting should be part of this, or the most recent amendment where you know, the autonomy of information commissioners have been taken away, or you can see the pendency of RTI. So if you file an RTI, it would probably take 1 or 2 years for you to get the information, which, you know, if you are not an activist, you will probably give it, you know, you would probably not pursue it further. Or you would see the vacancy of information commissioners at the State Information Commission or the Central Information Commission. And these are the challenges that the legal regime faces. But this is not to deny the fact, or this is not to kind of ignore the fact that from the times when the processes of governance were completely carried on in this culture of secrecy, there was a curtain. It is now actually open to scrutiny. And you can see it happening at many levels. So for instance, this whole debate on whether PM care should be part of RTI wouldn't have happened if there was no RTI. Or this whole information about how much money the Prime Minister's office spends on advertisements per day, which is, I think, 7.3 crores per day, would not have come in the public domain if it was not for RTI, or that in the farmers bill, there was no consultation with the farmers group, would not have come in the public domain if it was not for the right to information. So what I'm saying is there's a definite shift. However, the thickening of norms that Gabby talks about is something which needs to be probed further. And at least my my initial probe in Bihar shows that the responsibility of this has fallen on what we popularly known as what is popularly known in Indian media called RTI activists, which in my research I've called agents of accountability, who, as Gaby was saying, are new kind of brokers who seek their kind of dominance not from engaging with the state, but by seeking accountability from the state. And these are the core users of RTI, which have actually pushed back the system and pushed back the culture of secrecy. I think nowhere in the world I have heard that RTI activists are being killed or harassed by, because they file RTI applications. That's a testimony to how powerful the instrument and the tool is. The second thing about Akshay was talking about the opposition politics, and yeah, Akshay, go ahead. You have a question, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry because I have to jump off.
Okay.
But I just wanted to just throw in there a thought based on your first set of reactions. I'm just curious to think about on this issue of the thickening of the RTI norm and so on. I wonder what other criteria beyond the enactment of RTI you'd want to look at, and certainly implementation would be one of them. But I'm wondering what other aspects of information openness or sharing one could look at. For example, the production of governmental statistics. This has been going on since, this is pre-independence, the tradition of collection of statistics. And that has too gone through phases of being more open, more accurate, and then less open and less accurate. So I'm wondering, in terms of future work, this is really thinking about the future next project, which I think is going to be fascinating. And really, I mean, I can't wait to hear more about it. I'm wondering what other measures or indicators of openness or secrecy one could use beyond the RTI Act, given that there's others. And you can look at, for example, the creation of electoral bonds as a deeply non-transparent form of electoral finance happening, coinciding with other changes that might be more transparency oriented. So as you think through this next phase of churning, I would just maybe encourage or urge you to think about, beyond RTI, what are the other areas in which the state is covering or not covering the information that the public needs to make decisions. And on this, I was just thinking about how you might distinguish between ideas, norms, and laws and their implementation. And so could there be an idea of openness without a norm of openness? Could there be laws that favor openness, and maybe laws are part of the process of shifting the norm? I mean, why should we think that the law is the end? But why could it not be the part of a process of norm change? So anyway, I'll pause there, and I have to bid you adieu at this point. But this was a fascinating conversation. I'm sorry I can't stay longer. But let's talk more afterwards about your next project, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Thanks, Akshay.
Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. Akshay, you also talked about the policy deliberation, about the exchange of ideas between different sections, and that's like that was also a challenge to unpack. And that's why, Gabby, as you were mentioning that, you couldn't kind of find the details of who were these people, who were these technocrats who were taking these ideas forward, and it's simply because of the lack of information. For instance, the committee that the Charan Singh, the Home Minister during Janata Party, had constituted, I just couldn't find any trace of the file about that committee in either in the archives or in the Ministry of Home Affairs when I filed the RTI. Maybe it has just disappeared. Maybe it just does not exist. So these are the things one has to kind of look into, and the policy deliberation is something which is important because there are supporters of the norm, supporters of the idea of openness, and also kind of, as we know, people who opposed it. And this is what I call in my book ideational churning between the locked-in norm of secrecy, which was the norm, and kind of the nascent norms or nascent ideas on openness, which were actually just emerging on the fringes of the policy landscape, which eventually gave way to a kind of a policy change in a way. And that's why I call it kind of the final stage of layering, because the section 22 of RTI, Right to Information, actually says that in case of any conflict, potential conflict with any other law, it is the right to information which holds supreme. And so in my view, that's a pretty dramatic thing to have in the act, because that essentially means that if you invoke Official Secrets Act, or if you invoke any other act, it is Right to Information Act which holds supreme. But of course, in practice, that does not happen. The legal regime, when it hits the ground, it kind of attains a whole new face, so to speak, as to when it was kind of conceptualized. But yes, for the future research agenda, all the points are very valid. In fact, I'm going to take it in my stride and see how it goes. I'm going to let it travel, and hopefully somebody would pay for it, and I will get a grant someday. So these are my initial reactions, Hussein.
So thanks, Himanshu. Thanks for the comments and thanks for the answer. I think let's open the floor for all participants. You can just raise your hand and we can have a Q&As. So just.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the for the discussion. Thanks, Himanshu, for your book. Simple question. Somehow you were talking about it already. What is the real impact of this law? Maybe the glass is half full or empty. The implementation, success stories, and other stories who are. Maybe it is a risk, you mentioned also, is it really a risk in some cases to make an appeal referring to this law? You said it is if the reaction is very dangerous for a person who made an appeal, that shows the strength of the law, but the weakness of implementation, isn't it?
Phil, this is definitely a case of glass half full, not half empty and half full, because implementation, in the sense that there are challenges to the law. The culture of secrecy is so deep-rooted in the Indian bureaucracy and the Indian state that there's always this reluctance to part with information. So just filing a right to information does not mean that you will get information within 30 days, which is the stipulated time period. You probably have to chase it for a long time to get that information. So the relationship between the information giver and the information seeker, the supply chain and the demand side, the relationship is a tumultuous relationship. At least my fieldwork in Bihar has shown that invariably the local bureaucracy views people who file RTI in a negative light. So according to them, they are either blackmailers or they are middlemen or contractors who are after some people to blackmail them or get some money out of them. So they're always reluctant to part with information. However, on the other side, RTI has been used extensively throughout the country. So in fact, after the dilution, after the amendment of 2019, the number of RTI applications that the Central Information Commission has received has actually increased from 2018. So in my view, I think the strength of RTI is not so much as implementation, but the use of right to information by the citizens. In one of my interviews, actually, I've said that the strength of RTI is how much citizens use RTI. And you would see that RTI is actually used in cases where there are grievances. And actually, Gabby has written on grievances. She has just recently published an article on grievances in Madhya Pradesh at the police thana level. But so RTI is actually used in cases where there are grievances by the citizens, but there is a core of RTI users whom I call agents of accountability, who actually are deliberately seeking accountability from the state month end and month out. And that's the core of right to information. And these are the guys who are being threatened. Some of them are even killed. Who are, so for instance, somebody is exposing the land mafia on the ground. Somebody is exposing the corrupt nexus between the local village head and the politician who are pocketing all the money meant for the rural poor. So these are the guys who are, at the other end of the stick, so to speak, receive the other end of the stick. There are laws which are support kind of trying to check this. So for instance, there was a Whistleblowers Act some time back, but its implementation is at best patchy. And these are the challenges of the institutional progression of RTI, which one can see at the local level.
So thanks, Christian, and then Gabriele.
Thank you. First question today is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Thank you. First, I have to apologize because I missed the first part. I had some technical problems here, so I missed the first part. I also missed part of Gabi's presentation. So I have two questions. Maybe they have already been answered. So as I said, apologies. First question would be, when the RTI was passed, it was also passed by the Lok Sabha. So what was the debates and the deliberations in the committee of the Lok Sabha? I mean, there is a legislation process. It goes through several stages. What were the pros and cons, especially in the committees? You also bring in the experts, you bring in judges and people like this. So what was their view? What was their rationale? Second question, is there, when you said RTI is used all over the country, yes, can you see a difference in the usage of the RTI in certain states? And can you link it to political parties in the sense, can you make an argument like, if you have an acceptable political environment by opposition parties, number of RTI is likely to increase or the other way around? Is there something like a correlation on this? I mean, it's just a hypothesis from my side. Thanks, Himanshu.
Should I answer, Hussein, or?
Let's have a set of questions.
Okay.
Gabriele, please. You are mute.
Sorry, I lost my mouse and couldn't unmute myself for a moment. I just wanted to sort of respond a little bit and think through a little more the first set of comments, where Himanshu, you said something really interesting, is sort of thinking about the life of RTI, not just in terms of its implementation, which would be on the state side, the bureaucrat side, sort of enactment, and how long does it take, and do you actually get the information, and are the commissioner seats filled, and these sorts of things, but thinking more about users. And that was really interesting to me for two reasons. One is that it, I think, again underscores the desperate need for a citizen-centered account to complement your state-centered account. Because if the actual sort of impact and life of RTI is in these citizen users who are literally putting their lives on the line, then there's a really interesting question about why are they doing it? They must have some belief that it matters, some belief that there's a level of efficacy, that there's a that it will work at some level, or there's at least a hope that it will work. And so tracing through how those beliefs and ideas about the necessity of openness, about their ideas and beliefs are not just about the importance of information, but also about the potential responsiveness of the state, and about how citizens are weighing that potential responsiveness against potential risk. That's really, really interesting. And so I think for me, again, that brings to the fore the need for a kind of citizen-centered account of, in a way, parallel to what you've done. You've given us the state-centered account of how these ideas evolved and took root. But since the users are citizens, we then want to understand kind of how these ideas and beliefs are taking root there. A second thing, kind of moving beyond just narrow implementation, that I think would be really interesting is thinking about the spillovers of RTI. And so RTI doesn't stand alone. It's part of this kind of confluence of transparency measures, right? So in some of my recent work, I've been looking at the Jansanwai, the people's hearings in Madhya Pradesh. The word Jansanwai is not an accident, right? The MKSS started the Jansanwai as a citizen-led process in Rajasthan. Now you have the government of Madhya Pradesh taking the same language and saying, we have a Jansanwai, right? And actually implementing it. It's under a government order. It's now survived 3 different changes in government. It's becoming institutionalized. Bihar has the Lok Shikayat, right? So like thinking about how RTI is in interaction with and has informed and kind of has spilled over to, again, not just narrow implementation of RTI, but it's informed a whole landscape of transparency that in turn is creating the conditions and the kind of terrain upon which we're seeing all sorts of e-governance reforms, ombudsman's offices, right? All these sorts of things. So it would be really interesting to think through the relationship between RTI and these other transparency initiatives.
Hussain, should I answer or should we collect more?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you, Christian, for this. The Lok Sabha, at least in case of RTI, there were actually debate. I have kind of divided it into 2 phases. And the first phase is when there was a debate between. Of course, there was debate in the Lok Sabha on, for instance, when the 1967 amendment to the Official Secrets Act was introduced. So the opposition members were actually opposed to this amendment, and the ruling party was pushing for this amendment in 67. And the root cause of that was that the privilege of accessing information from the state was just limited to the ruling party. And the opposition members were not even allowed to kind of quote from the confidential documents within the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. And so this was the kind of, these were the debates in the first kind of phase that I'm tracing from 1947 till 1989. But what happens in 1989 is essentially that you should have a right to information or freedom of information or a law related to access to information. That kind of becomes a sine qua non between, within the state. So for instance, the National Front government, the VP Singh government was absolutely sure that you should have a law on access to information. There was a hiatus between 1991 and 96 when Congress was in power. But again, when the United Front government came to power, the processes start again. But there were differences, not about the law, but there are differences about issues that, whether you should, how much information should be disclosed, for instance. What are the items which should be disclosed? What are the items which should be exempted? These were the discussions which one can see within different committees. So you have cabinet committee where this was discussed. You had, Government of India constituted the group of ministers, which are called GOMs. Usually that's the norm when you have, are discussing a bill. You also had, department-related parliamentary standing committees, where people both from within the state and also the social actors came and deposed before the committee about what they think about right to information and what are the nitty-gritties of these laws. And so essentially the agreement was that whatever you can quote, whatever parliamentarians can use in the parliament should be extended, that privilege should be extended to the public as well. So that was the norm on which they kind of agreed upon. So these were the kind of debates within Lok Sabha. But RTI, the debate on RTI law itself was not a very fiery debate in the parliament. These are the nuances that you see in the cabinet papers or the group of ministers, and and probably that is also kind of a testimony of how you iron out the differences within closed doors. But when you hit the floor of the parliament, you kind of look very smooth, as if it's a very accepted idea. I'm just kind of juxtaposing it with some of the recent bills and the process related to it. The second thing about the subnational variation, yes, there is a subnational variation of how RTI is being used. So Maharashtra, for instance, is the front runner of RTI use. There are a lot of RTI activists in Maharashtra. There are in Andhra Pradesh is one of the states where it is being used. But surprising thing is states like Maharashtra, states like Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, which are part of the Bimaru states, are not lagging behind Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. I mean, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh have histories, legacy of social activism, and they're also more efficient states. But even in backward states like, so-called backward states like Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, you will see RTI activists actually using RTI. And why do they use this? They use it is something very interesting which is happening there, which I call emerging politics of accountability, which Gabby was hinting at, is that, RTI, at least at the village level, I see is being inextricably linked to local politics. Erstwhile dominant castes who have actually given way to, again, this comes back to the caste system and, not my state-centric approach, is that, RTI has a lot of, I asked a lot of RTI activists, why do you use RTI? It doesn't give you any monetary support. It doesn't give you anything. It actually makes makes a lot of enemies on the ground for you. Why do you use it? And they said they actually use the word varchasva. Varchasva in English means dominance. And by way of using RTI, they are kind of establishing their varchasva. I call it varchasva factor in one of my RTI articles. And why varchasva? Because they use a lot of RTI, their acceptance actually goes up within the bureaucratic realm. So you are known to the BDO as somebody who uses a lot of RTI. You are known to the district collector. You are known to the village mukhya. But because you use RTI, you are also getting close to the villagers in the sense, hey, you know what? I filed an RTI and this road got built. Or I filed an RTI, I made you file an RTI and you got a housing loan passed. So even your social dominance actually goes up. So some of these RTI activists at the local level, what Anirudh Krishna calls Naya Netas, or Rosenthal in '77 wrote about the expansive elites. These are the new kind of accountability elites or accountability agents which have actually emerged on the ground since RTI, which is an interesting case, and I would like to kind of probe it further. Gabby, I agree with all your points. Yes, I think it should lead in that direction where there is a kind of a shift from culture of secrecy to culture of openness. The change is also from de jure and de facto. That I'm saying because a lot of people are using RTI, but how thick is this norm change? In the sense that, how have actually rules of the game, how have the rules of the game changed? In the sense, informal norms, whether the behavior of bureaucrats have changed, how people have used RTI. So the, in the realm of informal norms, this is something that, one should expand and one should look at, especially when one is looking at an accountability regime like RTI.
Okay, Himanshu, thanks. Pralay, do you have a question? Yeah, please just unmute.
Yeah, Himanshu, many congratulations. Well, I don't have really a question, but some brief comments, which is, I'm taking cue from the discussions, observations. One is on, you talk about, many factors, but why did the Congress regime really accept this idea? I have a hypothesis which, may or may not be acceptable. But I think that, that if you look at the emergency little before, so Congress was corrupt, but the malice of the opposition was much, it's a kind of disproportionate. Say, for instance, Bofors, 76 or 70 crores, the campaign, the whole campaign, in a way, was responsible for the dismissal of the government. But if you see, so far, nothing has been proved. So that is one. So you can see that, so there are, if you look at emergency, in fact, the rumor machine of the opposition, particular brand opposition was much more lethal to the Congress. So part of the reasons which I think, influence this kind of acceptance of this, that, they are not really going to lose much. That's one. Say, for instance, another example I can give. You can see this 2G scam, coal scam, all these campaign. Again, Anna Hazare's campaign, which again is responsible for the, loss of the regime, the loss of power of the regime. But so far, nothing has come out. Sheila Dikshit's involvement in corruption. So this is one part that I think that they realize that, okay, so that's some part of corruption would be exposed, but, the way the opposition is able to really, damage the kind of reputation of the party, and this is one, this is my hypothesis, this is one perhaps. And, but today we are in a completely different situation because it was raised by the post-truth age. Say, for instance, you compare Rafale with Bofors, Bofors with Rafale. Well, even the Prime Minister of France, he's fumbling. So you can see that, like, of course, the security is always, coming in between. That's the ground of non-exposure. I mean, not giving you have a right to deny the information. But the way actually the whole Rafale thing, there is no transparency, but still, so what has happened today in Indian politics is that, some leaders are fallible, some leaders are infallible. The infallible leaders are not questioned. So if you look at this, so what is the role of this RTI when people believe that a particular leader is infallible? This is, this is one part. And the second, on evolution part, which is very interesting, that I don't know, I remember before this, long before, the CPM government in left front government in Bengal and Kerala, they have given the right to their cadre to interrogate, to question the bureaucrats. Say, for instance, BDO, that how much money this block level, there's a grant for this particular project, and the BDO is supposed to answer. So that is also another way, you know, at different subnational level, that is that perhaps part of the evolution, which is not exactly directly related, but somehow there is a kind of culture to really interrogate and, you know, to know exactly what is the budget and so on. Then very last part, the very last interesting question, I don't know, I mean, this, you know, you have a kind of ecosystem where this right to food, right to work, and right to information, these three are mentioned by the discussant It's very important that why actually, you know, this RTI got, you know, is privileged and the rest are really not. So this is a question, perhaps, you know, I think that, you know, I don't know, I'm just, you know, thinking aloud, that one is, of course, right to food and right to work, of course, you know, very commonsensical kind of understanding, that it involves a lot, resources. In terms of RTI, you are not really committing any kind of tangible material resources. You are giving information, of course, you know, so that is perhaps, you know, like, and right to work, still VP Singh promise that it would be a right to, you know, it's a fundamental right and so on. So these are, you know, rather more kind of issues involving, you know, doling out resources, which the state is not really prepared. If it cannot really make this MSP as a legal right, then obviously, how can you think that, you know, it would give you, you know, this right to work as a kind of right? Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that, Himanshu.
Thanks, Pralay. Your questions, as ever, are troubling. So, so why did Congress accept it? My take on it is a little different. My take on it is that, you know, it is actually the cumulative weight of earlier ideas that Congress accepted. If it was not Congress, if it was BJP, they would have done it as well. If it was not BJP, if it was United Front, they would have done it as well. My take on this is that, you know, the cumulative weight of earlier ideas actually rendered it inevitable at the central level. Interestingly, Congress was actually for a long time dragging its feet on the issue. In fact, as late as 1991, when Narasimha Rao became the prime minister, you would have actually thought that, you know, this was the era of economic reforms. They would have actually started the processes within the state to grant access to information, but they went ahead and actually amended something called Manual of Department Security Instructions, which actually is a way to classify documents in terms of its sensitivity. So, you know, whether it is confidential, secret, or top secret. So in that sense, Congress was dragging its feet for a long time. But as the state thinking transformed, it kind of became a thing that you would do. So, you know, that explains why, starting from 1989 onwards, there were cabinet committees which were constituted. The GOMs were constituted, which actually deliberated this from within the state. Remember, 1990s was also the time when the social actors actually start finding traction, not within the state, but outside the state. Actually, they're actually demanding accountability from the state at the local level. So I think my take on it is a little different. The second is about the CPM, yes, post-truth, I've actually Rafale deal and all that is there. In fact, during RTI came into the picture even during Rafale deal, when somebody had filed an RTI, and the Supreme Court said that these papers should be, they should not be covered under the Official Secrets Act, but should be treated as part of right to information. So that debate happened during Rafale as well. The CPM government, interestingly, Pralay, was completely against something like right to information. So this debate, which was happening in 1967 in the parliament on the amendment of Official Secrets Act, which actually made receiving and giving information a public offense, a non-bailable offense. All the major parties were actually against this, CPM was completely silent. The communists were completely silent on this in the debate in the parliament. So I think because I've also worked a little bit on West Bengal, perhaps the reason that they asked their cadres to seek accountability from the bureaucracy is because of the control that they wanted their cadres to have over bureaucracy, and not per se having accountability on their minds. The third is about the other rights-based legislations and right to information. I feel right to information was enacted during the same time, and there are kind of interrelations, right? So right to information is considered to be a integral part of right to work, or MGNREGS. And of course, right to work and right to information evolution stories also kind of co-joined. But I feel that right to information is a little bit different from these legislations, in the sense that right to work, or MGNREGS, can be considered a crossover between the directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights. So for instance, right to work and right to live is kind of seen together. This is a crossover. In right to information, there is no crossover which is happening. There is no directive principles of state policy on sharing and receiving information. It is the Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution which gives you freedom of expression and speech, which has been expanded itself or interpreted as inherently having right to know, right? So there's a difference. The second difference is there is no policy precursor to right to information, in the sense, for instance, right to work had a policy precursor of, starting from Antodaya or Employment Guarantee Act or Jawahar Rozgar Yojana. Right to information had no policy precursor. There was no policy. In fact, if there was a policy of sharing information, it was actually illegal to share information. It was governed by Official Secrets Act or sections 1, 2, 3 of Indian Evidence Act, or or manual of office procedures of Government of India. So I think these are the changes which make RTI a little bit different, and that's why RTI, in my view, is actually a case of institutional change, and that's why I have not argued that other rights-based legislations are case of institutional change, because they don't represent a kind of a norm shift, so to speak.
Thank you.
Thanks, Himanshu. Thank you so much. Is there any other question? I cannot see that here.
I have one more, but I've also spoken a lot, so I'll sit back if.
Yeah, please.
If anybody else I don't want to take up too much time, but okay.
No, go ahead.
So I had, Himanshu, a couple of more theoretical questions that have nothing to do with RTI in particular, but more about the theory that you present and sort of the scope conditions of that theory. So the first picks up a little bit on what I was saying about a norm of openness as opposed to a law of openness. And then Akshay, just before he left, was sort of also thinking about, what's the relationship between an idea, a norm, a law, and I would add to that an interest, because in the book you spend some time arguing that this isn't an interest story and that ideas can shape interests, which I think is absolutely right. But I think it also probably works in multiple directions. And so I'm wondering kind of theoretically how you would think about the differences between a norm, an idea, a law, which is some sort of expression of those things, and their relationship to interests. Does the arrow move in one way, kind of ideas are informing interests, or do you think that we can also see that kind of flipped or an interplay? So that's one sort of more kind of broad theoretical question. It's not about RTI in particular, but just kind of about how in this ideational argument you conceive of ideas and the relationship to norms and to law and to interests. The second, again, theoretical question is the layered tipping point model that you develop, right? That it's gradual, it's cumulative, it's ideational, and eventually you reach a critical mass in this tipping point. And it's a really powerful model. You lay it out in the book in contrast to a critical juncture model. And you spend some time sort of seemingly rejecting the critical juncture model. And I'm wondering if that was actually your intent, or if you meant that here, the tipping point model, the layered tipping point model, is another way, an additional way of thinking about institutional change alongside critical junctures. And so my question is, can we have both? Can we even have both in the same story? So in this case, it's clearly endogenous institutional change. Layered, you have me fully 100% convinced, I'm sold, right? But I wonder, are there still critical junctures baked into that? There's the Bangladesh war, the emergency, various corruption scandal, right? So can we think about critical junctures baked into endogenous change, and vice versa? If we went to sort of classic work on critical junctures, could we find endogenous change built into those? Are these maybe complementary lenses, or do you see them as kind of fundamentally different ways of approaching the question of institutional change?
Himanshu?
Thanks, Gabi. This is the question, and this is the question that I faced when I was actually working on this book as well, that when does idea become a norm, or when does norm become a kind of a legal regime? When does it become de jure? And in my sense, and at least, and because I always go by what my empirical material is telling me, is that it always starts with a certain kind of an idea, which I call, and which actually this term I've used in my book is, I call it institutional cropping, in the sense that when there's a nested norm, which is already kind of locked in within the system, and this is where the whole path dependent story comes in, that institutions are path dependent, they're stubborn, history matters, and that's why it's very cost ineffective to exit from the status quo. And this indeed is a story of the norm of secrecy, where there's a path dependence from the British colonial times. In fact, it becomes intensified in between in the 1960s. And so, but at the same time, there's a kind of an idea that, because we're a democracy, because, there's an idea of openness, it kind of emerges on the fringes, not necessarily from outside the state, but from within the state as well. So I feel that, ideas then eventually are interpreted as norms, as this whole nascent or rudimentary ideas which are emerging on the fringes actually move to the policy center stage gradually. They are interpreted as alternatives, so to speak, alternatives to the nested norms. And this can actually replace the persisting norm, or can actually fizzle out, depending on the strength of these ideas, depending on the supporters of these ideas, depending on the journey that they have within the state. That some of the ideas just don't find traction within the state, and they're completely rejected. And so my sense and my theory, my model actually talks to this journey of ideas emerging on the fringes, rudimentary ideas, actually being interpreted by as norms, and eventually kind of layer by layer, eventually replacing the nested norm of secrecy, which does not happen overnight, which does not happen within a span of one regime, but it happens over a span of number of political regimes, and slowly the state thinking then gets transformed in that sense. So that's why I say ideas shape interest, because if the state thinking or the ideas did not find traction within the state, or ideas had not transformed the state thinking, they would have dealt with the same social actors very differently. In the sense that, and in the first phase, even in the first phase, there were advocates of norms, or norm of openness, or ideas of openness. State just completely rejected them. But in the second phase, when there was kind of more traction within the state thinking about these norms, or alternatives, so to speak, the state was open to these ideas. So I think the arrow kind of is one way where it kind of emerges as alternative ideas, but then kind of are interpreted as alternative norms to the norm which has already been is nested within the state. So that's my take on this. The second is the late tipping point model and why it is not critical juncture. And this is actually goes back to this whole debate on ideas, where when Peter Hall was talking about the changes in policy paradigm, he talks about the first or the second or the third order change, and he stops with Margaret Thatcher in the third order change, and whether Margaret Thatcher was the critical juncture, or was it actually his first and second order or third order change which led to eventually led to the change in policy paradigm. In this story, there is no Margaret Thatcher, so to speak. In this story, there is no exogenous, there is no IMF or World Bank. There is no exogenous sudden shock, which actually alters a persisting institutional path. There was no compulsion that the Indian state should, change the norm of secrecy to norm of openness, right? There was no compulsion from outside. There was no, they could have ignored the social actors, but it was actually the gradual movement of these ideas which eventually became part of the state thinking. And that's why I thought that, that's why I think the tipping point model, which is a more of what my academic mentor, Professor Mukherjee, calls the earthquake model, where, the tectonic plates within the earth shift for a long period of time. There's an earthquake, which seems sudden, but the process has actually started a long time before. So this is something like of an earthquake model where you can trace these ideas emerging for a long time endogenously. And that's why I thought tipping point layered model is a much better alternative to capture this change. And that's why it's an alternative to a critical juncture theory.
So thanks, Himanshu. Thank you so much. I think we already passed the time and extra 5 minutes. I think, I do agree with Gabriel about critical juncture and this dichotomy between indigenous and exogenous. I think it is very important, interesting, and valid issue in our field. Actually, I have lots of other questions, but I prefer to continue it in other framework and platform to talk to Himanshu about these aspects. But I would like to thank you all.
One more last thing, because Gabby has actually, sorry, Hussein, for, another thing which is important is the sequencing. Janata Party is, of course, a catalyst in the sense that it came to power, but, the sequencing is something which one has to kind of take into consideration, because, these are interlinked sequences. So for instance, if Janata Party had not started thinking on those lines, the private members bill, which was tabled in the parliament in 80s, would not have, emerged. So I think the interlinked historical sequences is what makes it tipping point. And Janata Party, it will be problematic if you treat Janata Party as a critical juncture, because then the sequences, you will not be able to take into account the interrelated sequences which are spread across the historical line. So for instance, even before Janata Party, there were opposition demands of having kind of some sort of a legislation. And it is from there that Janata Party has actually come on the scene with that kind of context, political context in mind. So that's my take on it, Gabby. Sorry, Hussein.
No. I think this kind of conversation is just the beginning, to going to the depth and, So thank you so much. Thank you, Himanshu. Thanks, Gabriel, actually, and all of you for your participations, comments, insights, and reflections. Actually, I wish Himanshu a new project maybe continuation of this one or something completely new. Maybe it's on the exogenous variables or endogenous, whatever. We are looking forward to the next book of Dr. Jha.
Thanks, Hussein, and thanks, Gabby, and thanks everyone for putting in the question.